Let's get started. Like I said earlier, I want to keep this informal. I would like to make it informal. And I'd like, if you have questions while I'm going through the information, go ahead and raise your hand. If I think I'm going to answer it pretty close to that, and I'll just say, hang on, I think I'm going to get to it right there. Otherwise, I'll answer your question, okay? So the first thing I would just want to point out is that this slide right here shows two images. On the left is a conventional suburban pattern where things are intentionally separated, and it's a product of regular conventional zoning. Intentional separation, the roads are big, it's about moving cars fast, all those kinds of things, which a lot of people value very highly and pay a lot of money for. In our experience, the best zoning tool for that is what you already have, what we call conventional zoning, called Euclidean zoning. People have tried to apply form-based zoning to these environments. Form-based zoning was never invented for these environments. It was invented for what conventional zoning does not address, and that is the opposite of that pattern, the walkable, compact, mixed proximity kind of oriented neighborhoods that exist all over the country. And so the form-based zoning approach was invented for those places because people kept trying to build those kind of places, and they'd find that they need to get variance from the standards to build like a replica of something that was highly valued, 20 miles away. So I just want to point out that the form-based approach was never intended for what we call suburban development, that the conventional suburban zoning, which most cities have, works just fine for that, okay? In fact, early in my career, we were given some assignments for areas that were essentially suburban, and we didn't understand that what the client really wanted was better suburban development. That never really made a connection until we talked enough and started drawing things, and they said, whoa, what are you doing with all these? We don't want that. We want this. Oh, okay, so, that's, it just came to that conclusion pretty quickly. So I just want to start out by saying that the vision that's being prepared for the Vallco property, just like for any property in any process, has to be implemented through zoning. It just has to be. There's no other way. Zoning is going to implement it. And there are three basic ways or types of zoning. The first is what you already have, which most cities have in the United States, which came out 100 years ago when they invented zoning on the East Coast in response to lack of light and air and height concerns. And that's what we eventually got called Euclidean zoning, and we call conventional zoning. That's the first one. And the priority in that system is use. Yeah, it talks about height, talks about bulk, but it really can't articulate what it means by height and bulk. It's usually a maximum, and it's a system. Well, let me talk about the next one. So the next one is negotiated zoning. So people say, I don't want to use the zoning that's on that property because the zoning doesn't really respond to my needs. As a developer, as a community, whatever it is, it just doesn't respond to the kinds of needs that we have. And so what they do is they file for planned unit development or planned development. And a lot of cities call it very different things, but it's basically a negotiated zoning. And so if the downside with conventional zoning is that it's use-based, it's almost myopic, it's focused on use to the detriment of a lot of other important topics. The detriment of the negotiated zoning approach is that it often doesn't involve people. It's lawyers and city, and I'm not talking about your city, I'm talking about nationally, okay? The lawyers, the developer, the city, maybe some community groups get involved. They form basically a contract. Some presenters like me will call that contract zoning, because that's essentially what it becomes. So they work out the details of what the zoning will be, and it's almost always on a project basis, not on a plan. Like what you see us doing in that room over there in the Charrette, we're drawing some very detailed drawings to figure out the minimums and maximums, what can happen, what isn't feasible, what is feasible. But we're not designing a project. We're designing parameters that can turn into zoning so that individual projects, whether it's all one or individual projects, 5, 6, 7, or 8 projects, implement that 50-acre site, that they can happen. What you don't want is a fixed, like with the negotiating zoning, where it's one way, and That fails, you're back to the drawing board. You want standards that reflect your vision over the long term. So that is, when zoning is done correctly, that is what it's going to do. So the form-based approach, the third one on the right there, the priority there is physical character. So it deals with all these other characteristics, but physical character is number one. And again, that's why this form-based approach was invented, because a lot of people, it started on the East Coast, people had some really visionary developers that they were working for, and the architects and the planners would go to the county or the city and they'd say, hey, we want to base our development on this really cool area down the road. And they'd say, well, yeah, well, you can't build that. It doesn't meet our standards anymore. That's an outdated area. And well, wait, it's worth a lot of money. It's really valued. And you're telling us that your standards don't even recognize it. So a couple of the early projects like this used the negotiated zoning approach because people just didn't have the time to figure out how to fix the system. But after several of those, these architects and planners and developers said, the system's broken. We've got to offer another approach or make another approach for ourselves so we're not doing this over and over and over. So that's why form-based zoning was invented, because it, as I'll show, it responds to the physical characteristics of a place like regular zoning cannot. Just to show you nationally in our work, the trend between cities and developers and communities relying on the base zoning, R1, R2, C1, C2, all those kinds of base zones that exist on a zoning map, the trend between people relying on that and instead choosing negotiated zoning and figuring that out is huge. This is just graphically showing you. I don't have a table with the exact numbers, but I can share with you an example from Denver where the director of Denver graphed the number of negotiated or contract zoning proposals before they did a form-based code for their city and after. And it's dramatic. It's like this. It's unbelievable. It's most of the zoning applications were negotiated or PUDs, and when they did the update, which is form-based code, it turned into like, I don't know, 5%. It's incredible because of the clarity. You know, it's the clarity that this system provides in response to. And I'm not here to tell you it solves everything and it makes you jump higher and all that, like some people might. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm simply trying to show you the different options that you have for zoning and the way that they respond, the way that they function. So here's an example from Oklahoma City. We did a code diagnosis. This is a 620 square mile city, and about 350 square miles of it are actually development. The rest of it is way out, you know, hinterlands. Well, within those 300 square miles, big city, they have 2,600 and counting. As of last year, it was 2,600 of those negotiated zoning contracts, and the city said, enough. We've got to fix our zoning system because we can't continue with this. A couple reasons. One is you, the public, are left out of it because unless you're involved in that particular project, you don't know what happened. And even if you did, let's say somebody new comes in the neighborhood, they have to go to City Hall and school themselves on that permit, on that negotiated contract to understand what could be built there. Instead of simply saying, oh, what's the property zone? Oh, well, let me look up that zoning district in the code and find out what the intent and character is, what are the uses, and rely on that. You can't. You have to go look at the contract that was worked out in the plan unit development. So they got tired of it, and they asked us to analyze their code, and so we went through and did that with them. And this, I think next month, they're actually going to hire someone, whether it's us or somebody else, to actually go through and update that entire zoning code to get rid of. This is one of the problems. Yes?
They're updating for the entire city?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. More cities more and more are getting frustrated with their they're not getting rid of conventional zoning. They're applying form-based zoning to certain areas where it really needs to be applied. And they're also just structurally cleaning up their code to get rid of the need for this, because the other problem with so many plan unit development approaches is it takes more staff. And then let's say that staff, like I worked in a city early in my career, I was a public sector planner. And I'll never forget, I was City of Simi Valley in Southern California. And I was sitting there one day just learning from a senior planner, and somebody came in to ask about a certain plan unit development. And that person was on vacation. And they had to tell the member of the public, well, yeah, you can ask my superior, but I don't think they know. And I'm not really the best person to ask on it because I only know a little bit of it. I just came into the project. So because that person was vacation and the PUD, the planning development, was that thick, the person deferred and said, come back. Instead of being able to say, that property is zoned X, and here's what can happen. That's really not a very, and nobody meant anything. That was not intentional. That's just a symptom of the problem. Yes?
Maybe you could repeat my question, but how does form-based code ordinances mesh with design standards?
Oh, how do form-based codes mesh with design standards? It's a system, I'll explain that in more detail later, but it's a system basically set up to recognize as little or as much detail as you would like. So just another, I'm showing you symptoms and characteristics of the conventional zoning system so that you can appreciate why the form-based system was made the way that it is. So this is an excerpt of a land use table from a zoning code, and it's overly specific, which sounds like you would want this specificity, but that level of specificity invites even more specificity and more interpretation. I do this presentation in front of public planners, and when I present this slide and I give them experience like this, I say, you know, I worked in a city or worked as a consultant for cities, and somebody comes up with a use at the public counter and they go, it's not on the list of 800 uses or 200 uses, whatever, how long your list is. They have to confer. They go and meet with the city attorney, maybe the city manager, the planning director, and they huddle up. And it's not because they don't know, but they want to make a good decision, and it isn't clear enough on the list. And you'd say, well, wait, the list it's exhaustive. Yeah, but the more exhaustive you are in identifying things, the more cracks there are. So what we've done is we've learned, okay, there's a certain amount of specificity that is useful. And at some point, it's diminishing returns, and you have to really you have to categorize and do it that way. So, but the point here is that, here's an example. This is brand new. I was giving this presentation probably a month ago, and somebody emailed me this and said, I see what you're saying. I just looked it up in another city and found yogurt store retail. Well, what about, you know, just think of the different variations that you can make on that category or that type alone. And so you can see the logic in categorizing, not generalizing to the point of, whoa, we're in trouble. No, categorizing. And then you can, in the back of the zoning code, you can make definitions that say what you mean, but you want to make things useful in terms of lists and not paralyzing. And then lastly, on the conventional zoning system, you might call this a cheap shot, but this is where zoning started. This is why zoning was invented, to keep these things from happening next door. And you might say, well, that would never happen here. Yeah, fortunately, it isn't happening here. But the point is that that's the tool that 99.9% of cities in America use. And so that tool has continued to morph into the tool that it is. And the biggest lesson, the takeaway, is it was never a tool to generate. It was a tool to prevent. So think of if you personalized this and you said, everybody's been at a party, or just even worse, at a dinner party where you're sitting across from somebody for a couple hours, and all they do is tell you what they don't like. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Okay, at some point it stops being interesting. You know, some of it is interesting, right? But at some point you go, whoa, all you're doing is telling me what you don't like. And at some point you just want to say, is there anything that you do like? I don't even care what it is, just tell me what it is. And that's the way conventional zoning is. It's like, it's defense, 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 defense. At some point, well, what is it trying to make? If you could ask it a question, what are you trying to make? And I challenge is too strong a word. I invite you to look at, if you're really a code geek like I am and others, you'll do it. You'll go into a zoning code and look at a zoning district. And the question is, what is this place trying to make? If these standards were applied and these uses were applied, can I reasonably understand by reading this what it's going to generate? And the answer is usually not. Because even though you might put a picture there, it'll say, well, you can do it a million other ways. The point of this is that the conventional zoning system, I think I have a slide after this, yeah, the conventional zoning system it was never intended to generate. It was only as a prevention, and which is half of the problem. That's a very necessary half of the equation. But the other half is, well, what do you do once you stop everything? What is it that you're intending to allow? So yeah, so the problem is this, that cities have their zoning, and then some problem comes up and they realize, oh man, let's put another layer of regulation on it. Oh, whoa, last week somebody came in, let's put another layer of regulation, and it's all well intended. None of this is malicious, none of this is because people aren't smart. In fact, there are very, very smart people in these cities doing this. It's just, it takes a big shift to get yourself out of this pattern and do something else. So people keep patching with very good intentions, when the whole time the problem was that it was the base zoning that was really never fixed. Why do people never fix the base zoning? The most prevalent reason is that cities, communities, lawyers, everybody involved tends to say, whoa, that means we're going to technically rezone the property, and that means all kinds of things that we don't intend. Let's drop that option. So patch. We patch it, we patch it, we patch it. Meanwhile, you know, I could tell you city after city where we've been hired to look at a city's either existing code that they're thinking of you know, revising, or a developer calls and says, or a property owner calls and says, you know, I can't make heads or tails of these zoning classifications here in the city. Can you guys look at this? And often it's looking at through those layers. Cities have added these layers with all good intention, but you say, well, wow, layer 3 cancels out layer 2, but layer 2 doesn't cancel out layer 1 like they thought it would. And when you do the analysis, you go, whoa, I do this all day long, and it's making my head spin. So what the issue is, you've got to get back to the base zone. In conventional zoning, people are reticent to do that for the reasons I just said. Okay, so I was explaining the trend between negotiated zoning and conventional zoning, and because of the lack of responsiveness of conventional zoning to today's needs, either private developers, property owners, or designers, or the city itself, people are using the negotiated zoning tool. But when you bring in the form-based tool and offer it and get to talk to people about it, developers and everybody alike, and you say, hey, look, we're not selling that, we're showing it to you as an option. When all things considered, people choose the form-based system over the others. If you're trying to make one of these places, if you're trying to make suburbia, then we wouldn't even enter the conversation. We'd say, use the conventional tool or the negotiated, because this other one isn't made for that. And you might say, well, wow, how could that be? I'll explain. But this is the Denver, I'll give the city that slide on Denver. Peter Park, the director, shared it with us. It's very illuminating. I mean, it shows that decline in the negotiated contract zoning because of the form-based being offered. So the form-based principles are pretty simple. The rules for building form are as important as land use regulation itself. And see, that's a big departure from regular zoning, conventional zoning. It's just flipped the other way. Like the first slide I had showed the first system, conventional, and the biggest importance is the use, because that's how it started. So when people keep adding to that system, guess what's going to still stay at the top unless you demote it? And if you don't have enough information about what to prioritize in physical character, you're going to keep use as the priority. The emphasis is on mixing uses and mixing housing types. Now, I want to caution here, please don't walk away from this and say, oh, that guy said it's all about mixed use. No, it's about mixing. And sometimes it's mixing immediately adjacent, mixing on the first floor, mixing in different ways. If this was a longer session, I could show you a bunch of different options of that. But for example, everybody's seen the house near a downtown or near a main street that's converted to something other than residential, right? So that's on a very small scale, and then there's everything in between, right? So mixing is relative, but the form-based code allows for it, it doesn't penalize it. The public realm, so do you know what I mean when I say public realm? Okay, I'll explain for, oh, somebody's saying they don't, okay. So the public realm is when you walk outside a building, let's say that's one side, okay, over there. Those doors are one side of the public realm. You exited your house. And maybe your house is a front yard, or like these buildings over here by the library, and they have stoops and little elevated terraces. You just walked out. That wall that is your front door is one side of the public realm. The other side is the other side of the street, and it's building in that wall. So in the case I just gave you with the library and those buildings with the stoops across the street, that library facade and the facades across the street with the stoops, when you're in that section of that street, that is the public realm. And so wherever you are, it changes, and it's either very positive and, you know, appealing, or it's not. And so in the form-based code, the public realm gets huge attention, and you'll see that in the drawings over there. That and that's a very big departure from conventional practice, which is, hey, we're the Public Works Department, and I'm not talking about this one. I'm talking about nationally, my experience. The Public Works Department says the right-of-way is ours, the private property is the private property owners, and the city and everybody else. But the right-of-way, stay out of that. Well, guess what? The right-of-way from the sidewalk out to the other is part of that public realm. It has a huge determination on how your property performs or doesn't, and how your property appeals or doesn't. Huge. And so part of what we do in these processes is to bring that to the top and make people aware of it and make it part of the standards. Because if you're just going from the facade to the back of the sidewalk, you're affecting a lot, but there's a lot that you're not affecting, and it could really be detrimental to what it is you're trying to do. And then the standards, to get your question about form-based standards and design standards, this principle about they're intentionally based on the context. I'll get into that in some of the slides here. But essentially, the way that the form-based system works is it says, okay, what's the physical character in the environment that you're trying to make? Or does it already exist and you're simply trying to make more of it? Whatever the question is, literally we take a DNA sample. If it already is there, we take a DNA sample, take it apart and say, what makes that place the way it is? Measure it, take it apart, and then you reverse engineer that into standards. And then the last one is the public process. These codes are always done in a public process because we are fighting against that negotiated approach where it's not done behind the scenes, but it's not necessarily always very public. Yes.
So I'm curious. Do you see, you often see we'll see the term placemaking around doing this kind of design. Do you see that as similar to public realm, or do you see that?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, you're making place. You're intentionally making a place, and when we use the word context here, not every main street's the same, not every neighborhood's the same, not every side street's the same. It's all context. There's a continuum, a spectrum of intensity of all subjects. Yes. And then just before I get into the rest of it, so early on, we were doing these codes, and city attorneys and other people were starting to say, I don't know if this is zoning. You know, there's so many design terms in here and so many diagrams, and wow, this just doesn't look anything like the conventional zoning that we have on the books, and you know, I'm a little worried. And so we'd have to get attorneys that would speak to their attorneys, and they'd ultimately go, okay, we get it, we understand, but I wanted to hear it from somebody in my arena, my realm, and another attorney. And so that happened enough times where a group of people and a group of colleagues got together, wrote some white papers, and approached the state and said, hey, can you just recognize this as a viable alternative for zoning? And they did. So they passed AB 1268 14 years ago. It was legal before that, but this gave people or cities the ability to look at it and say, oh, okay, our city attorney can now rely on this law and not be out on the plank thinking that they're doing something really crazy. So. All right, so I like to explain form-based codes this way, because it's the way I understood it. I'd been writing them for a while, and when I started to have to try and explain them to people, the way I internalized it was, well, I first used the graphic equalizer, but this is my condensed version of this explanation. So if we had more time, I'd ask you questions about what this does, but generally, the thing that the recording studio, or this recording studio engineer's deck, I don't know the technical term for it, but this piece of equipment, it coordinates very different elements. And so let's say there was an orchestra or there was a band and had vocalists, all these different elements, and it coordinates them for one integrated outcome. So if you make the analogy to the built environment, and you say you have streets, you have streetscapes, you have blocks, you have signs, you have uses, you have architecture, you name it. that board could go to the left or the right as many times as you want, with as many topics as you want. And then, because now you can see those systems or those elements of the physical environment, you can put dials on them that analogous to settings and standards, right? Where in the conventional approach, it's uses, bulk, height, and it's missing all these topics. The form-based approach that's how it started. It's like, hey, we know there are at least like 8 base topics, maybe 10, depending on how you look at it. And we can add to those depending on the priority of the community. And by area, so what's important in Vallco might not be as important in another area. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, it depends. But I just want to make the point that each one of these topics, think of the whole board as you working on that board for one zoning district. All those topics occur in every zoning district, and in Vallco there'll probably be 3 or 4, I don't know. But in a property that size, probably 3 or 4 zoning districts. So think of all those topics and think of you as a team of engineers sitting there saying, hey, for signage in this zoning district, what are we going to do? Turn it up or turn it down? Well, it depends. Depends on the intended physical character, context, right? So that's how I understood the form-based code, and that's my way of explaining it to you very simply. Yes?
I have a question. I spent a lot of time in Europe, and I was talking with one of the better Cupertino folks who's also spent a lot of time in Europe. We had a long email exchange, and she terrified me because at the end of the exchange she said, "You're beginning to sound like one of us." But really the core of the conversation is laws of aesthetics. You know, the Greek golden section, proportion, that kind of thing. How does that tie in with form-based design and design standards?
Again, it's a priority of the community. If the community says, hey, we went to Europe, the question was, how does the form-based system respond to timeless design principles and approaches, right? Is that what, yeah, okay. And the answer is that, again, we look around, you'll hear Dan Perlich and others on the team use the word precedent. Now, when you talk to a lawyer or a planner, a precedent is something to avoid or something to use as interpretation. When we talk to designers, what we're saying is it's an example of something to do again, okay? Some people use that term negatively. We use it positively to say, oh, so in Cupertino, they've done some research. Okay, what is relevant here as an example, as a precedent? So that's the way we incorporate that. And we don't stick to it and say, well, you know, the Greeks said that this is the proportion for buildings, so it's got to be that. I mean, you know, if you had some Greek buildings here and we could measure them and go, oh, they're using the Greek proportions. Oh, well, let's use that. Then there would be relevance, right? Does that make sense, the soundboard and all that? Okay, all right. So I'm going to walk you through what a form-based code looks like. So all that preface to give you, I just wanted you to understand where we're coming from and why before I start showing you what it is. Because for me, if you just showed me what it was and didn't tell me why, I wouldn't appreciate it as much. So every code that we write it begins with an intent page. And if you look at the intent in a conventional zoning code, it is the exact opposite of this. A, it doesn't have a graphic. But even if it didn't have a graphic, if you could see below, right there in the middle column, it's not showing on the screen, but the bottom below that blue line has an intent statement about the physical character. And it isn't like most zoning districts where it'll say, oh, the C3 zone is meant to have commercial uses and be in harmony with, what's harmony? You know, it's debatable, right? This talks about the scale and size of buildings, the kinds of uses and their proximity to other things. It says that every time for every district. And then in the middle column on that page and below the blue line, it actually identifies, are the buildings elevated from the street? Are they set back from the street? We haven't gotten to numbers. This is qualitative. This is linking the vision with another layer of information so that it isn't just a vision and numbers. You want something in between. When somebody challenges the numbers, you can go back to that link in between, which is there, and say, hey, the intent of this zoning district is the buildings are X. The buildings are set back, no, they're near the street. Are the buildings attached or detached? Are the buildings footprints small, medium, or large? All that information is really, really important when somebody comes and challenges 5 years later. Hey, you know that setback? It says 12 feet. I want to change it to X. Well, what's going to guide you on changing it to X or holding it the way it is? And it's going to be that intent information in the middle. Yes?
So this quantitative versus qualitative. With SD 35, okay, if it isn't an objective standard, basically they can throw it out.
Okay.
So this becomes a very
Well, let me.
all going to be reasonable. That that's fine. It all makes sense. But in the new world order.
Well, let me stop you right there. I know what you're saying. I use the word qualitative, but again, we aren't to the standards yet. This is the intent statement of the zoning district. So it's not qualitative that's not enforceable. It's the opposite. It's actually enforceable intent statement language. That's what it is. So it is not correct. I'm not saying you're incorrect. I'm saying that it is not correct to say that that is qualitative, unenforceable language. It's actually enforceable intent language. It's just it's articulated beyond a sentence. It's put into statements of physical character that are then picked up in the zoning code itself. Yes?
Just clarification, you've used the term zoning district several times.
Yeah.
And you said Vallco is probably like 3 different zoning districts, potentially. Well, first, can you define what a zoning district is in your terminology?
So a zoning district, every city has zoning districts or zones. Maybe I should have used the word zone, but some cities use zoning district or zone district. They use one of those 3 terms for like a C4 zoning district, commercial, R1 zoning district or zone. That's what I'm referring to. Okay. And when I talk about a zone, all the topics in a form-based code are coordinated for an integrated outcome, which they are not coordinated for an integrated outcome in a conventional zone. That's why I'm making that distinction.
And so does that mean that with form-based zoning that you actually have multiple, like for Vallco, there would be 3 different definitions of form, or is it integrated in the same?
Can somebody help with a microphone for these questions? So the question is, in a form-based code, would there be multiple zoning districts? That's true for both systems. It's true for the conventional system and for the form-based system. The difference is that in the form-based system, the form-based zones, I'm going to use the term zone, is focused on physical character and use, not just use. And in the conventional zoning, it's the use with some light talk about physical character. Yeah, but they both use multiple zones to get the job done. Yeah. And then that intent page, and the zone, I'm going to stop saying zone district. The zone begins with that intent page. And I really invite you to look at other zoning pages. Look at this one here. I don't remember the title of the zoning code here, but look at it, and you're going to see that I'm not criticizing it. I'm just simply comparing. You're going to see the intent statement to be something that begs a lot of questions and is missing that information I was describing here. So the next page is a set of the set of standards about building form, where the building needs to be placed to create that. See, every standard in form-based zone is reverse engineered to deliver the environment that zone said it's going to deliver. So in the intent statement, it's saying we're making a certain place here, and here are these characteristics of it. Building footprints are large, or they're small, or they're medium, and we define that. Buildings are at least 4 stories, or not over 3. All those kinds of things that lead you to the standards are said here, and then those are unpacked here in the detail standards. In order to make that physical environment, you've got to put the building here, and the setback is X to Y. And the buildings have to be attached, or they have to be detached. Whatever it is, those building force standards appear here. You probably know them as building setbacks. There's building height, building setbacks, but then a form-based code goes further and says, wait, in order to make that environment, we've got to make sure the parking is not messing up the streetscape and not being too close to the front or to the sides of the building. So we have parking setbacks to make sure that the parking's in the right location to make that environment. Again, everything is aimed at making that, like if we were going to make this environment several times and you wanted to predictably know what was going to happen, you would write rules that predictably generate this environment. That's what this zone is doing. It's giving you standards that will generate that environment. Then the next topic is building size and footprint. So it's one thing to say, set it back, attach it or detach it, there's a rear setback, but how big is that footprint? Well, it depends. It depends on the character of that area. If it's really intense, the buildings are attached and the building footprints are large, and and go down from that. It just depends. And then uses. So a lot of form-based codes, I think, are misunderstood because people say, oh, you're just focused on physical character. You're not going to regulate use. It's going to be a mayhem here. And I think some of the original codes 30 years ago were more architecturally oriented than they probably should have been, but they had a different intention and different role 30 years ago. And so the use didn't get talked about, but uses are definitely regulated. As I always like to say, in a complete form-based code, they're regulated. In an incomplete one, they are not. And then a new topic gets inserted called frontages. And this is critical. Like all those other things are critical, but this is even more critical. And frontage is how the ground floor of a building's, its facade, how that ground floor facade actually attaches to the sidewalk, to the streetscape. And maybe has a front yard, maybe has a dooryard, maybe has a stoop, maybe has a terrace. There are all kinds of options. Maybe it's a shop front. It's right at the back of the sidewalk. All kinds of options that exist out in the physical world that you can now turn into types and allow or not allow based on the physical character you're trying to generate. So here I'm showing two types. I'm showing the forecourt on the left, which is you're walking down the sidewalk and then all of a sudden, whoa, there's an indentation and a little plaza, part of the building, and the buildings form it. And so this gives standards for how big that should be, how deep is too deep, what kind of ground floor openings you need to make that a positive space. And then the one on the right is for shop front. So frontages. And then streets and civic spaces. So again, I talked about the need to regulate the design of the street, and there's a lot of work there to be done in every city. It's not an easy thing to do, but I understand the Public Works Department here is better than a lot than I've seen. So I'm encouraged to hear that, and that's really great. Because if you get the middle of the street wrong, you can get all this other stuff right, and it's going to be like an 80% achievement, and you want the whole thing. And so on the right, then there are standards for civic spaces. So instead of just saying, well, we want open space and we'll figure it out later, you can actually put a certain amount of that into standards, or all of it into standards. It depends. That's the other thing with these kinds of standards. You can dial up the level of regulation and say, we want to regulate every last thing because we don't trust anybody. Or you can say, like some cities, well, we just want to get a few of the things right, and we're open to the design process, and we'll work with people so they dial it down. Maybe you're in the middle to the top. I don't know. So, but it's adjustable is what I'm saying. You can see as little or as much detail and regulation as you like. And then lastly, I just want to go through a couple images here about the built environment. So do you see the buildings on the left? This is St. Helena, or Healdsburg, I'm sorry. And you see the buildings on the left are more solid and bigger than the buildings on the right. Everybody see that? So the buildings on the left are what we call block scale, and the buildings on the right are what we call house scale. Pretty intuitive. The house scale, it's like buildings that are the size of houses. Small cottage to a mansion. There's a reality about how big buildings are when they're houses, and whether they're used by 3 units or 6 units or 1, or there's a store or a restaurant in it now. You can look at something and say, that's a house scale building. And it's a real easy way to categorize the built environment and talk with people and say, hey, are you talking about block scale buildings? Yeah. Oh, okay, I got it. And it takes you a couple minutes to learn it, and then you got it. Well, the current conventional system doesn't use that. It uses numbers that are based on the idea of populating big areas of land when we had a lot of vacant areas in the country. That's why these things were invented, to be able to project over 2,000 acres how many units you're going to get. Well, we don't have those problems anymore. So this system of using density, and I'm going to talk about floor area ratio, it's really, it's more of a measuring device than should not be a regulatory device, but too many cities do use it, unfortunately. So I just wanted to start by saying, look at these two buildings. They could not be more different in their size, especially. One is 180 units. It's only 3 stories, but it's 180 units, and it's huge. It goes off the screen. It's bigger than the screen. The other one is a beautiful 5-unit, what we call mansion apartment in Pasadena. 5 units, but look at the density. They're only one number apart. So does it really serve to have wars about density like so many communities do? It's about size and scale. Yes, maybe at some point the number of people living next door is a factor, but that isn't going to tell you that. Here wouldn't tell you that. Here's another example from Vallco where we were working a couple years ago. These buildings are almost identical in scale and size, yet they differ by the number of units. Some are flats and some are not. And so one has 3 and it's at, I think, 53 units, or yeah, and the other one's at 82. Yet their physical scale is almost identical. And the lesson here is that the density, so many people talk about density so long, and it's like adding water to lemonade. It's too strong, add more water. The density is too high, extend the lot. Get a lot merger and buy a little more of the lot next to you, and the density goes down. But did the physical scale change? No. So it's the wrong argument to be having, and so many communities do spend a lot of time on this argument. And just to sum up here, that we have started to go further. Like we apply the block scale and house scale idea to buildings, but in terms of thinking of the whole system, we've actually started to apply this thing of small, medium, and large. You probably heard Dan talk about it, that you can take every topic across the spectrum, a physical spectrum, and identify it. Is it small? Is it medium, large? Or in some cases, extra large, like downtown San Francisco. You can actually do that and set those parameters. So I want to show you here, I've done that. And I've taken out the proprietor's logo because I didn't want to get a commercial for anybody, and I won't tell you who it is. Don't guess. But you see on the bottom, small, medium, large. And for Cupertino and for Vallco, what the team has identified as a beginning point, this is not the end, but a beginning point to start talking, is that small means 2 to 4 stories, and medium is 5 to 12, and large is over 12, it's 13 and up. And that has a lot to do with the size of buildings, but more to do, well, there's much to do with construction types. Some things don't get built, at 8 stories, they get built at 12. There's certain buildings that begin at 12, and let me revise that. These numbers correlate to construction realities. So you have to make sure that you're in sync with that, because otherwise your rules could be out of sync and miss things. So we are correlating it for the intensities that are thought about at Vallco. We're using these sizes, and again, it's the beginning point in the process. And then lastly, this information gets put on a map called a regulating plan, and so we'll have to work that out with your city officials and your attorney. But the regulating plan differs from a zoning map in that it's basically a 3-dimensional zoning map. It does more than just simply identify what uses are allowed and how tall the building can be and what the density is. It has all these other characteristics embedded in it. Further, you could say, this doesn't work there, but you could say, like on Vallco especially, you could say, you know what? That map is going to tell you where the prime civic space needs to be. Not where we'd like it to be, where it needs to be. You could actually do that on one of these maps. Now, some cities don't, because that sort of cuts out some possibilities, but I don't know. Maybe that's something to consider here. I'm just telling you the power of one of these types of maps, that you can actually show a lot of your intentions in with regulatory status, okay? And I just want to sum up by saying that all these things I just showed you about, how we do it, the conventional system doesn't do that. The conventional system spends time on floor area ratio, and people argue about it, and yet this is one of my best examples. It's in Pasadena. Same floor area ratio, couldn't be more different. And that's because you can manipulate floor area ratio to do all kinds of things. You can make it do anything. As long as you're using your allocated floor area ratio, you can squish it up one side, you can move it around. How predictable is that? And if you're talking to your neighbor, would you rather have a discussion about, they're proposing some medium 5 to 10 story buildings, or would you rather say they're proposing 1.72 48 to the acre buildings? I mean, I'm an expert, so I can jump at what 1.72 and 48 means, but not as quickly as you think. It still means a lot of questions for me. So I imagine for the general public, it's even harder to determine. And just lastly, a couple slides here about compatible but compliant realities. These are things that are compliant with the rules. They're in Los Angeles. But they couldn't be more incompatible. But see, one is on a corridor, and the other one is in a neighborhood that's not going to change. It's beautiful. You probably have neighborhoods like that here. Really, small 1- to 2-story bungalow neighborhoods. They're both within their rights, but they're also right next to each other, and nobody really ever thought about the realities of the sizes of buildings in these two places. They both have to be where they are. The realities of real estate, intensity, all those things, but nobody figured out how to deal with that. So what most cities do is they say, well, we'll just have a wedding cake step back and get that building to step back. Well, that looks good if you're standing here looking down the fence of both houses. But if you look at it from the air and look at it and say, wait, those are little houses next to these bigger buildings. The form-based approach would say, okay, why don't we push the big part of the building that needs to happen economically? There's a reality to that. Let's push that toward the corridor, and what the neighbors feel are smaller wings, the size of their houses. Like, let's say their house is 40 or 60 feet wide. The big part of the building goes against the corridor, and what the neighbors feel, what they experience, are these smaller wings that are more reasonable, like medium size or smaller, that they perceive. That's the form-based approach to the same problem. So the last thing I just want to leave with you before we have more questions is just to say, I'm not here to convince you of form-based zoning. I'm here to try and explain it to you and to, well, as dispassionately as I can. I know I'm passionate about it, but I've worked with the other systems, and I've tried other approaches, and this approach is the most effective. And so you can differ, and you can have your own approach and thought. That's your choice. But I have practiced this for 25 years now. I've worked on a lot of codes and learned a lot. And I teach it now to planning students, because part of what I run into across the country is that more and more planners I meet, they're either allergic to it, as I was telling staff here, they're either allergic to it because they're afraid of it. It's like this new information, like, I wasn't trained in that. My professor, I really valued that person, and they didn't teach me about this, so somehow this is suspect. Or they love it, but they don't really understand it. So I committed myself, when somebody gave me the opportunity to teach at the university level, I jumped on it, and I've been teaching for 5 years at UCLA and Cal Poly Pomona, and I teach undergrads and graduate students about this. And I say, I'm going to take you through a 10-week course to really steep you in this and show you so that it's a skill you have. So when you go to a city, you at least know something about it. Otherwise, people will look at you and expect you to know it. So again, I'm telling you I'm not selling it to you, but I realize that I am passionate about it because I've tried the other systems and they're not as effective. But again, if you differ, I respectfully accept that. Yes?
Well, I think that is so amazing.
So we have a microphone here. If you raise your hand, and Tony can point you out, and I'll come by and hand you the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you for the information regarding the zone-based zoning and whatnot. It seems to me it's very interesting, but I guess the question that I'm interested in finding out is that the answer that I'm interested in finding out is that the main issue to me, it seems like we're missing the public transportation piece. So based on my personal research, the cities who are doing well in terms of comprehensive planning, making everyone happy, is that they have public transportation plan along with office and growth. It happens simultaneously, or there's a plan in place. It doesn't just build a bunch of housing, office, without the public transportation. That seems to me it's really the main issue that's happening in Cupertino. How do you address that? I mean,
that's not a zoning issue. That's a community amenity infrastructure issue. Like, people in Cupertino have better transit, that's why I live there. Or people in Cupertino have better schools, that's why I live there. It's not a zoning issue, it's a community amenity.
So what you're saying is that this zoning doesn't really solve the real problem of transportation issue?
No zoning solves the problem of transportation issue.
Okay, well, there you go.
Well,
thank you.
Well, yeah, but let me respond to that differently. I'm answering your question, but you're asking a question that sounds with a certain thing in mind. I'm saying no zoning solves it, but that isn't the end of the answer. No zoning solves it is my answer because it's not a zoning issue. Providing enough housing to make transit viable is a zoning issue. And that is made easier by this system than conventional. So my answer to you is that it's not a zoning issue and you can't look for it and say, oh, I click that box and transit's going to happen. But by the same token, if you don't provide enough housing intensity or job intensity or proximity, which is a zoning issue, and this system addresses, then you won't make transit viable. Yes.
Related to that, it is potentially a part of the zoning issue if you say we want a transit hub, we want a facility, that can be written into the form-based.
It can, totally. And what I'm saying is that the number of people living in proximity and access to that transit station is a zoning issue.
Right.
The transit system is another matter.
The system, but the facility for the system can be a part of, like, I want to say, in Vallco, I want to see an area that's designated as providing good public transit.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes. There's a question way in the back. It's cool to see this many people here talking about zoning. Wow. You guys are hardcore.
So this is, I'm just going to do this before my real question.
Can you put the microphone closer?
Yeah, if I have to. So you're saying zoning doesn't deal with traffic, but I would argue.
I didn't say zoning doesn't deal with traffic. I never said that.
I'm not wording it correctly, but what I want to say is zoning is part of planning. In my opinion, zoning comes under planning, and planning has to take into account transit. That's all. So my question was...
yeah, we agree.
Do you have any examples of cities near us or in San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, that currently use form-based codes, either project,
Redwood City is the closest to you.
And can you give an example of where it was used and people...
Redwood City in their downtown.
Downtown.
Yeah.
So
it's fairly new. I'd say that's a 7-year-old code, and they have new buildings coming out of the ground.
So where the box places and city...
I don't know Redwood City. I don't know the place well enough to tell you this street, but I've looked on Google Earth over the past year or two and seen new buildings. But I know that they have a code there. It's got to be 7 years old, 5 years old, something like that.
So I guess my next question was, you may not be able to answer, if they were single sites or full city, and when did they shift and why? But if you didn't work with those cities, you're not going to know. So non-local cities, you touched on why there was a shift in some, but can you give us, have you worked with a city that's similar to ours in a region that's similar to ours that said, enough is enough, we're doing form-based code and we're not just going to do it for a single site, we're going to do it for the whole blasted city because fill in the blank.
Right. Well, as I mentioned with my first slide, it never is done for the entire city because this, I don't know, maybe you weren't here for this. My opening statement was that this tool is only applied to what we call walkable urban, not auto-oriented suburban. And a lot of the built landscape is auto-oriented suburban. And this tool was never meant for that. The conventional zoning tool is perfectly fine for that. Okay, so yeah, so when I say the entire city, what I'm saying is that they did a citywide code update, and 60% of their city used form-based zones, and 40%, I'm guessing right now at the proportion, it's something like that, and 40% continued with conventional zoning. In Austin, Texas, where we're working right now, that city is probably 30-70, 30 walkable urban, and 70 conventional, auto-oriented suburban. It's usually that kind of percentage where these cities had, the walkable pattern, and then they really grew these suburban patterns on it. And it's usually about 1/4, 3/4, typically. Like in Oklahoma City, we analyzed that, and it was like, 20-80, 30-70, something like that is the typical pattern. And downtown Petaluma is another downtown nearby that used one of these. And there's one, I can't think of the name of the place, but it's here in the Bay Area, probably, well, we're working in downtown Hayward right now. But that isn't adopted. There's another one, I can't think of the name of it right now, but we'll give your city a list and give you that information. But it's more than you'd imagine. Well, maybe, I don't know what you imagine. It's a lot.
So one quick comment and then a question on the transportation issue. I think one of the things that I find personally very frustrating is that cities control the land use, but the counties are the ones that control the transportation network. So yeah. I think this is where a lot of the disconnect is in terms of transportation planning. So while it is planning, it's a totally different jurisdiction, and that makes it really, really hard.
Right.
But on your question, to my main question about this is great. It's nice to see the baseline concepts. With something like Vallco, it's a single owner, and walkable urbanism very organically, in like the 1920s and the cities that the very small fine-grained cities that we kind of love as urban and walkable were parceled out. Lots of little parcels, make up an aggregate whole. So what is how does the form-based zoning model kind of help to break down these large single site, single owner
right.
Parcels and get that, I guess, finer grain feel, which is what's some of the thinking behind that, or codification?
Yeah, right. Well, that's a great technical question, and what we do is a lot of codes are, what we do is you provide standards to basically, it's in some intensities, like say downtown San Francisco, downtown Oakland, it's the opposite. It's okay that things are bigger and all that. So what you want to do is go the opposite and say, we want to reflect that smaller increment when you're walking past, 75-foot facade, another 50-foot facade, nothing too big, in terms of the length across the sidewalk, because you start to feel like, wow, this is way too big a scale. And so what you do, a couple of things you can do. You can either insert what we call a facade increment standards. You can say individual facades can't be longer than X, but the danger in doing that is that with a bad designer, they can do like Candyland or something. So you often want to support that with other standards, such as, okay, you own the whole thing, but within this block, you have to break up that block into lots, design lots. The design lot means that for the purposes of design, not the purposes of legal ownership, but the purposes of design, that lot then has to have a building facade respond to that lot width. So now it's like the lots are really always there, and now the designers are designing at least the facade of the building. If it's a big giant building, it's going to be the facade. If it's less intense and the buildings are detached, then they would be designing buildings that are detached to respond to those design lots. And then the owner has the option of either subdividing the land into those lots that they designed the buildings to and keeping them as legal, or, hey, we achieved our purposes of design, let's dissolve the lots, and you got it. So we usually use the facade method and then the design lot method. That's the short answer to that. We could talk about that for an hour. Yes. There's one right over there.
Stay on this side.
Okay.
So I think one of the things that is probably implicit in your presentation, I think it's fantastic stuff. One of the things that we're particularly weak on here is that the existing zoning that we have doesn't address mixed use very well. And that actually, you see that
most cities don't. Most cities don't. It's not unique to Cupertino.
Yeah, it's not the nature. And so I think one of the things that's really important, whether you decide to do it by, you could create a mixed use zone as well, a mixed use zone definition as well. I think this is a much better way to do it, because it's exactly that exception problem.
Yeah.
And it's something that has the opportunity to scale across that thing.
So,
and I would actually point out for the people here, you actually see that. I think when somebody who's familiar with planning, with modern planning, comes to visit Main Street here, they actually kind of wonder how come it's only one floor of restaurants, and that actually is a fallout directly it's a shortcoming of the traditional zoning that was used to drive that plan. It would have done much better if we would have solved, addressed the housing issue better if it had upper floors that were, residential above. But that's one of the things that you just, you can never untangle that knot.
So you just touched on something I wanted to talk about. I think I went past it a little in my presentation. Do you remember that slide I had where it showed the 3 sizes of lots? And it said small, medium, and large. We call it small, medium, and large, but the reality, the point of that slide, let me go to it. Just bear with me 2 seconds here. There, this one. The point of this is exactly that cities have different sizes of lots, and they apply the same standards to those lots in the same zone. And you're nodding your head like, yeah, I see that. The problem is that usually, and I applied the small, medium, and large. The cities haven't started using that terminology. But the small one, what we find is that typically when you do that, you apply the same zoning district, that thing, you apply the C4, the R4, apply that zone to those 3 same properties that are in that zone. You tend to overzone the small property and cause bad projects because it has too much potential that was never figured out mathematically how it could fit. They just said, well, that's what we allowed in this zone, and that property's in this zone, so we map it in that zone, and whoa, we got too much. The developer says they want to put 8 units on it, but really only 5 fit. Well, nobody ever figured that out because the conventional zoning system doesn't ask those questions. So the small properties are overzoned, but the inverse problem happens on the large properties. They're underzoned. So that's what caught me to your question. You're talking about a building that's 1 story and it could have been all this more. Well, it's underzoned. If you start to look at things of what they could be and start to constrain them, constrain them physically, you'll understand that most properties are underzoned or overzoned. Because, again, there's no malice here. It's not like people at City Hall went, how do we underzone that guy's property? Nobody's doing that. It's just they're applying a one size approach to all kinds of properties in the same zone. Yes?
I just want to mention a couple things. You're talking about the small, medium, and large, and you're talking about the stories, okay?
Yeah.
So for residential, they're showing like 10 feet for a floor-to-floor. And then
who's they? I don't know who you're talking about.
This would be the SB 35 plan.
Okay.
So they're showing 10 feet floor to floor for residential and 17 foot 6 inches for office. So that makes a huge difference for how tall it's going to end up being.
So again, the stories usually, we typically regulate by stories and feet. So you say 4 stories or X feet, whatever that is, and wherever you're measuring it to. That's different in every city. So it's and.
Okay, good. And the second part is both Measure D and Vallco SB 35 showed parking across the entire lots, two floors underground. And when I visited this morning, Katerina said that they were having underground parking. So that decision's already been made.
They who?
That the
design team that we're working on right now?
So that's, and
okay,
to
let me just tell you what I know. I'm not telling you I know every detail what they're doing this minute. But as of this morning, it's not an underground parking garage over the whole thing. There is underground parking because some of those buildings are going to be intense. But my understanding is it's not a Disneyland garage under the whole site like that.
Okay, and I also want to bring up that
that's my understanding. I might not be up to date on all of it, but that was my understanding yesterday.
Okay, so while Measure D had the 2 layers of underground parking, they also ended up having a 9-story above ground parking structure, and all the residential buildings had internal parking structures as well. So it needed a lot more. They had about 6,500 spaces, and SB 35 has about 10,500. So you're talking about the streetscape, but in order to maintain some of these streetscapes the way you want it, you have to have all of these kind of embedded parking structures hidden around on the lot. And then lastly,
well, it depends. Sorry, just to respond to that, it depends on the assumptions for parking. It depends on the viability of transit. All these things play into it. And so the suburban approach is, well, we're not going to count on it at all, so we're going to park it all. And so you get these giant buildings with giant garages.
Right. Okay, so, and lastly is the EIR is studying basically Measure D. So what is it that they're designing up there? Is it the 2 million square feet of office? I mean, it looks really big.
Yeah, I'm here to talk to you about the zoning. I don't know the development program right now to be able to talk intelligently about that.
So how do they know how big to make what they're doing? I mean, what's guiding them?
They're working on it. Again, I really don't. I'm not avoiding your question. I don't know the answer. And I'm not the person to ask. Don't look at me and look at me like, well, how come he doesn't know? I don't know.
Well, I mean, nobody's been able to answer.
No, that's not true.
Well,
that's
I mean,
not true.
up there, nobody can tell me.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that to be the case that they don't know what they're doing. That'd be really shocking. They have parameters, and I really doubt that they don't know what they're doing.
They're not sharing them. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's actually a pretty good paradigm. The thing
when you say it, what are you referring to?
Form-based coding.
Okay.
But the thing that really worries me is that if you start from a particular design and then you write the codes that that basically enable it, right?
Yeah.
Then somebody can take those codes and wind up with an entirely different design working the other way, which is sort of what Sandhill has done. And I keep coming back to Sandhill, but the reality is those guys can't be trusted, okay? And that's what this SB 35 thing is all about. So I just want to express that it's not you or your outfit or whatever. It's that anytime you do something new, the risk of unintended consequences is always higher because you haven't gone through the thing before. And
are you saying that by applying form-based zoning here that you haven't been applied before, it's a bigger risk than using the existing system? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying in this environment, you're going to get a lot of pushback because I just want you to understand
because it hasn't been used before here, that people will resist it just because of that. Am I understanding you right? I mean, yeah, change is, we're in the business of change. Does something change a little, nothing, a lot? That's what we're talking about. And again, I'll tell you, dispassionately or passionately, however you want to take my posture, using the existing system that you have, that most cities have, it's anemic on the topics it regulates. It just is. And especially hearing the level of concern that you have, I'm not judging your concern, I'm hearing it. My sense is you want to twist that dial to regulate more than less. And you can do that so much better with this tool than you can with the tool you have. I'll just leave it there. Yes. I'm not criticizing you, I'm just expanding on what you're saying.
So I'm interested in the dynamic. I mean, you can get as prescriptive as you want with form-based code.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about how the dynamic works with the developer, right? I mean, the city works on zoning and coding, and then the developer decides if a site is going to get developed, and it depends on economic circumstances and all of that. If the code is overly prescriptive, what typically happens? Do we rip it up and start over? And if a developer says, gosh, I want to put my thumbprint on this and I want something that looks a lot different, if we are very constraining in that, does that inhibit? And so I'm really interested in how the development community reacts to this. And I could see some advantage from their perspective if, in being prescriptive, it may take some of the uncertainty out of the equation, right? To say, okay, if the rules are really clear, I know whether I can make money on this or not, and I don't have to invest a lot of time in redoing everything from the ground up. So I could see both sides, but I'm wondering, as a practical matter, what your experience has been in the real world.
Yeah, so the certainty is for both sides. It's usually only talked about for developers, that they want the certainty and the predictability for the process. But we like to point out, you as a community want that too, because that's why I pointed out the negotiated contract approach. You have to revisit that process every time that somebody new comes through, but if you have it in standards, it's certain for both. And I shouldn't say sides, it makes it sound adversarial, but in this case, you know, it sounds sort of like that. But anyway, yeah, anyway, the reality is that with a form-based code, like with any conventional code too, you can be over-prescriptive and really stifle development. Yeah. And usually it happens when you're not realistic in the standards. Like, it's not going to be the number of standards or the level of regulation that usually drives somebody crazy. It's that the standards were irrelevant to begin with and overly optimistic on some things that never were viable, namely parking assumptions, street change assumptions, those kinds of things that just kill a project. And so people say the whole thing is suspect because those base factors were never really relevant to begin with. So that's how you can be not even overly prescriptive, but sort of useless. So that's why we're spending time to understand, again, we're not designing a project, we're designing parameters that will lead to standards that don't stifle, but it's a fine balance, give you the predictability of what you can expect without having to watch every meeting, every plan, everything. Because that's where you'll kill, that's the other end of the answer. You'll kill a project by saying, like some form-based codes, you know, we could talk about this for 3 hours, but I was telling the staff, you want to be careful where you strike the balance on every topic that you regulate. Because early codes, people saw, wow, we can regulate all these topics. Let's turn the dials all the way up. And we said, well, let's turn some down because, you know, that's too much. And we ended up at a certain point. Well, then the city council or somebody else comes in and says, we love this. We still want to review every project. Well, you just took all the predictability out of it. So it was predictable, or the planning commission, or whatever it would be in that community. You provided all this predictability and developers said, wow, it's a higher bar, but we see the bar and we're willing to deal with that. But now you just took all that certainty away by saying it was still this tough decision that is to the whim of 5 people. And I'm not talking about, I don't use the word whim to criticize any leaders here. I'm simply saying that it's still their choice. And you just said that it wasn't. It's all worked out in these standards. So if you do this, part of what you're agreeing to is, hey, this is our pact. I shouldn't have that up there. This is our pact with people who want to invest here. We're saying these are our standards, this is our process, and we're not going to make you go through a second process to get there. That'll kill everything. And some cities with early form-based codes did that to our. We just advised against it, but we're not the city council, so we can't tell you what to do. Yes, you had a. Oh, sorry. Yes. And I'm just speaking very candidly here to be completely, I want to relate to you. I have a lot of experience. Our office has a lot of experience. The last thing I want to do is not be candid with you about things that did work or didn't work. You know, I'm telling you. You know.
So typically, how are things like if a developer decides that they're okay with 90% of the form-based specifications, but they'd really like to do X differently? How is that handled in the process?
Right, so there's a standard section that we put in the codes called adjustments. And they're administrative adjustments, usually between 5, 15, and 20% of a standard. And it's not all across the board, it depends on the standard. So parking setback. There's a good idea that nobody thought of, and the standard says X. Let's say it says 7 feet setback. Well, you know, when you do all these things, it works out that they need it to be 5 feet 7 inches. Well, the standard says 7 feet. Well, the adjustment process has findings in there that are stated for everybody to see. If these things are present in the situation, you can adjust the standard by X. So usually we do that. And it's not for every topic in the book. It's for certain topics like that.
So who makes the decision
about the public process of doing the code. So when we write the code, we'll prepare a draft that gets reviewed by the public, commented on by the public. Hopefully there'll be meetings to work with you on like helping you understand how it's different from your existing code so that you don't just start reviewing and pouring into it, but you actually have some training about it, hopefully. And then when you're reviewing it, you'll have a hand in, just like all the other standards, you'll be able to say, I think that's too much leniency or not enough, you know. But again, it keeps it from requiring somebody that has a good idea and meets the intent of the code and is off by 3 or 4 inches on a standard from having to go to the city council for some massive adjustment that everybody says, why are you here? You know, just do it administratively. If it meets the intent, and we put findings that are very clear. If it doesn't, then you can't do it. But you as the public would see that through the process of drafting the code. Yes. Well, you guys are people usually aren't interested in zoning to this extent, so this is great.
I do see some of the advantages of form-based versus the current way we're doing things in terms of flexibility and variety and other things that are lacking in what we're doing right now. But the form-based coding involves more of the community and things like that. I understand that too. What I have a question about is we're building for the future, correct? I mean,
yes.
Everything we build will last for 30 to 50 years or something like that into the future. But we're thinking about the present, and especially in a community like this, where there are a lot of people who don't want to see change. What you're going to see is a lot of coding of any kind. It's going to be more of the same thing, perhaps. I'm just saying that that's a possibility. And one of the problems we have right now are trying to envision what's going to happen in the future when these buildings outlast ourselves.
So are you saying that you want these standards to have standards for the buildings that follow?
Well, I'm just saying that that the community doesn't always know what is best for the future. We know what's best for now. Mm-hmm. And so we talk about what we want for now, but we don't always know what is best for the future. And that's problematic, I guess, in general. I was wondering if form-based coding will help us to plan better for the future where these buildings are actually going to be planned for. It takes 4 or 5 years to just get a plan approved and break ground, and then the building lasts another 30 to 50 years. So we're talking about something in the future, not talking about now.
Right. So to make that as practical as I can, one of the issues that probably will change a lot, one of the factors that will change a lot in the next 5-10 years will be parking and auto use and all that. So we would probably be a little more flexible on parking requirements or parking location, or more restrictive about where it goes. I mean, that is a subject that needs a lot more, a lot of thought about how far to regulate, how much to require, how much not to require. That is clearly a subject. The other ones, I don't know yet. Haven't dug into it yet. But I just say this, that because the form-based code responds to all the physical characteristics that you want it to respond to. There's a base set of characteristics, but it can go further, like I showed. You again can choose to regulate these more or less to respond to your issue, to your question. Sorry, I can't tell you what's going to happen in 52 years.
I have a question related to density. I've been involved with a number of different groups, urban, Stevens Creek Urban Advisory Group, and so on and so forth. One topic that keeps coming up is that the density. So there's one group of people that keeps saying that we need more density in order to be able to build public transportation. Mm-hmm. And you also addressed that early on. Can you please clarify how does that make sense? I mean, we are dealing with traffic every day right now. It takes much longer, 2 times to get to work for everybody. Mm-hmm. These are real concerns of local residents. So what kind of density and how does that connect to traffic? And I mean, in the big scheme of things, how do you address that?
Yeah, I don't have a cool little table or graph that shows you at this threshold, transit is viable. I'm sure somebody does. I don't have that. A transportation consultant probably does have those numbers based on context, based on, proximity to certain destinations, here's when a threshold when viability of the transit is viable. I don't have that. I would expect that. But there is logic that says the more people that are available to ride transit, that they would take it. But here's the thing. The reason that that tends not to work is because people still keep the suburban assumptions of the parking requirements, namely. They say, okay, we're going to allow all those high-intensity units in that 7-story building, but each one of them has to have 2 parking spaces, or 1.5, because we're assuming everybody's going to drive. Well, if you do that, the people that buy those units are probably going to bring their cars with them. But like some parking consultants are advocating in the past 5 to 10 years, they say, let some of those units, if not all of them in certain contexts, unbundle their parking and let people buy the parking like they would a second bedroom. Say, I don't need a 2-bedroom unit, I just want a 1-bedroom. Apply this same logic to parking and say, you know, I only have 1 car and I think I'm gonna get rid of it. I don't even wanna buy a parking space in that building. Let that happen. And it's starting to happen, like in San Francisco, but it's not happening enough. And that would change people's outlook on whether or not they take transit. You know, we can say they're going to take it, but if they're bringing their cars with them, they're probably not going to take it, right? So you can affect it through parking requirements, namely, is what I'm saying. There are a bunch of questions here. I don't know who was first.
Well, actually, mine is not so much a question as just say, thank you very much. Oh. You have clarified for me why this form-based coding makes more sense. You know, when you start talking about use, I'm not familiar with planning that much, and it suddenly dawned on me, we're creating new types of businesses that are not in an existing code. Yeah. And so it's this trying to force the new back to the old standards that's creating all sorts of, you know, exceptions to what really is there. Yeah. And that was just a big aha to me.
Oh, good.
To understand, you know, it's hard to dig in and understand what's the problem you're addressing, and you did it very well.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
Interestingly, that was what I was going to say. Was when I first came in, I was like, why would we want to change zone? It'd be complicated and blah, blah, blah. But one of your very first slides, you showed that this applies to an urban walkable thing, and that's what we're in the process of designing.
Exactly.
And that large lots like this are underzoned using the traditional sort of zoning. So basically, it sounds like you were very convincing, may I say, in just the simple way you approached it, and I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I've been humbled over the years. Yes.
So, to get back to parking and transportation, I think my guess is everyone in this room agrees with the comments here, and I'm grateful that the comment was brought up. Cities do the planning, counties do the transportation. It's a huge jump to think that we're going to get what we would need even if we are dense enough. And that's the continuing problem. We all know we don't ever get it. Councilmember Sinks can give you a long history of we haven't gotten what we should get, and we are dense enough to get it, and we still don't have it, and yet they still want to become denser. We don't have any control over that. So it's really backward for me, and I know I'm not alone. That's all.
Do you have a response, or should we go to the next question?
No, yeah.
Thank you. Hi. My brother lives in Portland, Oregon. Raised his family there.
Bill Leonard's lives there.
Yes, and my niece got out of Corvallis and just started looking for a job. And the parents went along with her to look for an apartment. I think I updated the city on this. She did get a job, all right. But one of the issues that my brother and sister-in-law were very, very adamant about was that they did not want her to lease an apartment where she did not have on-site parking, because they did not want her parking her car in the adjacent neighborhoods, because they live near Reed College and people are parking their cars in their neighborhood to use the new I don't know what, it's a light transit thing that goes through there. They are parking all over their Reed College, if you're familiar with it, that neighborhood is being inundated with cars in the last 2 years. So my niece, they also were worried about her vehicle being left out in the residential neighborhood, like where I live, and taking up the parking for other people. So we're coming out at this both ways. We have a young lady who wants to get an apartment, and the parents that are seeing what's happening in their neighborhood. And Reed College is gorgeous, okay, and they don't like the cars that have come in from transit, okay, whatever. But at this point, she wound up getting an apartment with her boyfriend. They got two units, and they're paying per month for the 2 cars at the parents' insistence. And also, they found out that most of the apartments that were just built downtown have no parking, and she didn't rent there because her parents wouldn't let her.
Any other questions?
Any other questions, comments? Yeah. Oh, one more here.
Thank you for your energy and your comments, and yeah, thank you. Yes.
I just have a comment on what you've presented. If I understand correctly, the form-based zoning principles that you've been trying to describe to us, it seems to me there's significant advantages to the process that you're explaining. To the staff for the city, it can minimize all the bureaucracy and the infinite mathematical details of the zoning process, and that can be of significant value to the city.
Yes.
For the community, it seems to me from what you're explaining that rather than us having to try to understand everything being described in mathematical numbers, you're presenting a concept, a new plan, a new way of doing things that allows us to better understand conceptually the experience that will be had by people interacting with, living with, visiting this environment. And to me, that's the beauty of what you're saying, because I cannot look at a bunch of zoning codes and have any vision whatsoever in my mind what that's going to represent when it's built. It's like saying to you, would you please describe this cat mathematically to me in immense detail?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, and that's what we have now. And it seems to me that the process you're describing is to try to move from that kind of system to a system whereby you're describing to us and showing us a way that we can understand what the experience would be like to live with a cat.
Well, yeah, or if it's a cat at all. Yeah, that's a very insightful comment, ma'am. I want to just build on that and say that, so here's a page of the standards. This is what our typical pages look like. We haven't made your pages. They could look different than this, but this is what a lot of our codes look like. What is going to help here is that in many places we work on a vision like this, and then the result are zoning standards. But in Vallco, there's going to be this thing called a specific plan that actually expresses, and what you're talking about, what it feels like to be there. You won't get that from these numbers and these diagrams. I mean, the people that write it and you go through a process, you'd get it. But if you just opened it up the first day, you wouldn't know that. What's going to illustrate that and be illustrate it will be the specific plan. The specific plan has to be, the zoning has to be specific or consistent with the specific plan. So the zoning is implementing what you see in the specific plan. So the specific plan is going to lay out very carefully, here's what we're looking for, and these zoning standards happen to generate that. So it's a hand in hand. And I just want to emphasize that in a lot of situations, it's not less. I mean, it's not detrimental, it's just less and different, is that we are not hired to do a specific plan, we're hired just to do the standards. In this case, you're going to have both. So you'd have to be blind in many ways to not see, and I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about people that disagree with the intent or say they don't get it. It's going to be very difficult to say you don't get it, because it's going to be clear and without being stifling, and you're going to say, oh, this is what was intended, and these standards implement that.
So one last question or comment over here.
I just had a question about typical implementation process, is it more often that a form-based code is applied initially to something like a project at Vallco and then extended to other specific projects?
Depends on the city. It depends on the need. Like, I don't know Cupertino well enough to know how many other sites would really be walkable urban, but hearing yesterday's retail discussion about how many retail sites are going to contract and not be retail sites anymore, then those 20-acre shopping centers are probably mini versions of that. And I don't want to, when I say that, and I say walkable urban, you know, the slide I showed on the very first slide, the one on the right there where I said that was for walkable urban, that's South Pasadena. The biggest building I have is 3 stories tall. So walkable urban doesn't mean that it's always going to be the intensity of Vallco. Okay, I want to really put that out there. There's a spectrum of everything, right? There's a spectrum of chairs, there's a spectrum of rings, everything, body sizes, small to large. The same thing with buildings and physical environments. Low intensity, high intensity, small, large.
So associated with that, it would be likely that we wouldn't rezone or do anything with the zoning for areas that are not walkable urban within Cupertino. Most of the residential areas.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's another reason why we make that distinction very clearly at the beginning, because for a lot of years we knew that in our minds, but it wasn't obvious to others. Like, you're sitting there and people would get really irritated and they say, this is coming to my neighborhood, that's never going to change, they would basically describe it in an auto-oriented suburban context. We'd say, oh man, sorry, we never meant it for that. You know, so, and then they'd go, oh, and they'd leave. So yeah, well, leave because they were relieved that they didn't have to participate in that. They weren't interested in it, or wasn't going to come to their block when they were thinking that it might. Yeah, so yeah, it can be applied to other places, but again, each zone generates an environment, right? So the question about extending the zones that'll end up on Vallco is, do you want some more Vallco to occur? Probably not. It's probably going to be less intense than that. So you'd probably make a different zone, a less intense form-based zone for another place. That's my sense. I don't know your town well enough to know that, but that's my sense. Yeah.
The main thoroughfare through town is a zone that we call a special area we call Heart of the City.
Yeah.
And that also is an example of something that is the plan there predates mixed use and walkability as a focus. So, you know, I would hope that some of the things that come from the things that support walkability at Vallco, you know, those things may be something you would consider for improvement to Main Street down.
Remember, you want to use this tool where you can reasonably expect to generate a couple blocks at least, you know, at least 2 blocks of a walkable urban environment that's connected to something else where people can actually be reasonably expected to walk there as a choice. That's different than a project that's isolated, that everybody goes there and drives there and then enjoys themselves. The walkable urban pattern, people might do that, but it's more likely that the people within that pattern or adjacent to it can go to it. That's really what sets it apart. Otherwise, you're just making it, you know, another thing that requires everybody to drive to, and that's not the intent of this.
Thank you, Tony, for the presentation, and thank you everyone for coming. Just keep in mind,
thanks.
We still have a team over at EOC. If you have questions and look at models, they're over at EOC, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.